Hello, good afternoon, or depending where you're joining us from anywhere in the world, good morning or good evening. This event comes to you from the Wolfson Foundation and British Academy. My name is Rana Mitter. I teach Chinese history and I'm a fellow of the British Academy, but I'm here today to host a very exciting event, a chance for all of us to celebrate the winner of the Wolfson History Prize 2020. It's awarded by the Wolfson Foundation annually, has been awarded for over 40 years annually, and the Wolfson History Prize is the United Kingdom's most prestigious prize for the writing of history, recognising and celebrating books that were published within the last year and which combine not only really outstanding research, but also had all-important quality, genuine readability. Now, the judging panel, which was chaired by the president of the Academy, Professor Sir David Canadine, shortlisted 6 books just a few weeks ago, with the winner announced at a virtual ceremony back in June. And it was Professor David Abulafia who took home the coveted £40,000 prize for his book, The Boundless Sea, a human history of the oceans. David Abulafia is a maritime historian who specialises in the political, economic, religious and social history of the Mediterranean in the late Middle Ages, and also in attitudes in late medieval Europe to non-Christian religions and peoples. A fellow of the British Academy, he's also professor of Mediterranean history at the University of Cambridge, and he's published a number of works, including another award-winning book, The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean, back in 2011, which I can also personally attest is a very good read. So I'm delighted to welcome David to our virtual stage here today for a discussion about writing history and indeed about his current prize-winning book. And he and I are going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to take a selection of your questions, the audience. So please do send them in through our chat functions. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit this using the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen. And of course, you're very welcome to tweet during the event. And if so, could you copy in at British Academy and at Wolfson History or hashtag Wolfson History Prize. David, welcome today, and thanks so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. I wonder if, for those who haven't yet had a chance to read your book, which I have to say is a wonderful tome, but not a short one, it clocks in at best part of, I think, about 900 pages. Could you give us the key arguments that underpin the book?
Yes. Well, obviously, in a book of 900, 1,000 pages, if you include the index, it's difficult to sort of summarize very quickly. But I think, in a way, the book is summarized by the very first map, which is a map of the world. And it's a map which has no labels attached to it, but quite deliberately, all the maritime spaces are coloured in sort of dark grey, and the land spaces are just left completely blank in white. And so what one sees, of course, is that about 70% of the surface of the globe is covered with water. The Pacific alone accounts for about 1/3 of the surface of the globe. And not surprisingly, people have talked about how we shouldn't really be talking about the Earth as planet Earth. We should be talking about it as planet Ocean, the blue planet, and so on, as it is when seen from space. So it's that sort of perspective on trying to write a history of humanity, a history of the world, but from that maritime angle. That's what I've really been trying to do, and trying to write about how human beings have related to the sea. So it's not actually a book about what happens under the surface of the sea. You won't find much about sort of ecological problems under the surface of the sea. It's about these very large spaces, which are so different to the smaller sorts of spaces, which I have also written about, like the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean accounts for 0.8% of the maritime surface of the globe. So really, it's very small compared to the oceans and has a very different character. There's a very intensive contact between the three shores, the three ocean, the three continents that border the Mediterranean. When we look at the oceans, when we're looking at these vast ocean spaces, which open and sort of indeterminate to the first people who try to cross them, not knowing where they're going, it's a very different sort of story. And yet it is also a story, as so much of maritime history is, not just of political conquest, not just of explorers and things like this, Columbus and so on. It's also, very importantly, a story of contact being maintained between different civilizations, between different peoples, sometimes in a very violent way, certainly, but contact generally being maintained through the creation of commercial networks, and these commercial networks carrying with them also certain cultural attributes. So we have the spread, perhaps one of the most important of these cultural features is the spread of different religions. So you have the spread of Islam across the Indian Ocean, you have the spread of Buddhism into these seas beyond China to reach Japan in particular. You have the spread of Christianity when the Portuguese arrive in Japan and have dreams of converting the Japanese population in the 17th century. So it's these connections, which are not simply business connections across space, that particularly fascinate me. At the same time, it's a very slow process, this mastery, if I can use that word, of the oceans. It's something which has taken millennia. So one really has to go very far back in time to understand how it is that we reach, in the age following Columbus, we reach this sort of European ascendancy, if you like, across the oceans, with European shipping in all three great oceans. But there's a very long history going much, much further back in time, in which the inhabitants of the lands around these shores have been exceptionally active, navigating these seas, setting up trade routes, settling islands, all that sort of thing is the essential background to the experience of more recent centuries. And all that also raises questions about the origins of globalization. This is a word which is bandied around, and one thing I do say at one point is, well, it depends what you mean. I mean, where is one going to, what particular moment is one going to choose as the moment when globalization can be said to be genuinely underway? But what's fascinating about all of this is we're talking about writing the history of spaces, which, apart from those islands, which play a very important role undoubtedly, but it's not a space that can be permanently inhabited. It's a space on which you move. And so it's a different type of history. It's the history of people crossing the sea. That is really what the book is about. And that's why the subtitle is A Human History of the Oceans.
David, the overall span of the book is immensely lengthy. It's nearly 250,000 years, 200,000 anyway. Do human beings have an equally lengthy historical relationship with each of the major oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, or is there a sort of hierarchy of history?
There is a sort of hierarchy, and that does explain the way in which I organized the book, actually, because before Columbus and Vasco da Gama, before the opening of the routes to America and India from the Iberian Peninsula, one really has to deal with the three great oceans separately. There was some interaction by way of the Mediterranean between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, spices coming through. But basically, we have to deal with the three great oceans separately. So that actually led me to think precisely about this sort of hierarchy that one might want to devise. And the book actually begins with a section about the Pacific Ocean. And by Pacific, I don't mean the waters close to Japan and China and Taiwan and so on, which are in many ways have to be seen, particularly from the commercial and political perspective, as a sort of an extension of the Indian Ocean. But I mean those great open spaces, Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, stretching right across to New Zealand, to Easter Island, which were colonized over many, many millennia. Indeed, it's very difficult to work out exactly when this process began. It may well have begun even before our type of human being came into existence. So the great problem of what motivated these people to move across the islands dominates that section of the book, culminating around 1300, maybe 1350 AD, in the settlement of New Zealand. It's as recent as that. And the very latest DNA evidence, which I've managed to incorporate in the paperback, which will be out soon, shows that they actually did, the Polynesians did reach South America. And they brought South Americans back with them to the Marquesas Islands. This is all based on DNA. So that extraordinary history of encompassing what, as I said a moment ago, is actually the largest ocean on the planet. But then one needs to start thinking also about the role of the Indian Ocean, because looking in the other direction, moving from those Spice Islands, what we now call Indonesia and Malaysia, moving from those islands westwards, we have these routes which in antiquity carried such phenomenal quantities of spices all the way through to the Red Sea, to the Mediterranean, to warehouses in ancient Rome, and then in the Middle Ages as far as Riga and Tallinn in the Baltic. So those networks, as they develop, very different in character. That's not the sort of issue one's dealing with in the Pacific. Here one's dealing with commercial networks, highly developed, under Greco-Roman merchants from the days of the Emperor Augustus onwards, and continuing without too much interruption across the centuries, what we call the Silk Road of the Sea, because these routes also linked up to China and brought silk and porcelain in phenomenal quantities all the way to countries like Egypt. So that is the second great ocean that I deal with, and in the intensity of these commercial relationships across the Indian Ocean, well before the arrival of the Portuguese around 1500, is very striking. And the role of the local merchants, the Tamils, the Malays, the Arabs and so on, these people are very heavily involved in the movement of goods back and forth. A very large community, very well-documented community of Jews from Cairo who turn up in India and set up brass workshops and things like that in southern India in the 12th century. It's a very rich history and well recorded. And so the youngest of these oceans, I'm setting aside the Arctic Ocean and the Southern Ocean, but the youngest of these oceans is in many ways the Atlantic, because although we do know, there's no doubt about it at all, that the Norsemen actually managed to reach not just Greenland, where they lived for over 400 years, but they did reach the North American continent without settling there for any length of time. The vast space of the Atlantic remained a neglected area. And of course, it's very different to the Pacific. The Pacific has these great clusters of islands. In the Atlantic, there are little island groups, but very much separated from one another. And the only island group that was settled by human beings before the arrival of the Europeans were the Canary Islands, where there was a Berber population, pre-Islamic Berber population. So it's a very different sort of story. It's the European arrival in these islands, like Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde. These were unpopulated, uninhabited places, virgin territory, which were then subjected to a sort of ecological disaster in some cases as a result of the Europeans pasturing their animals on the land, stripping the land bare, or in the case of Madeira, transforming the island into a centre of sugar production without its like anywhere in late medieval Europe. So each of these oceans before the time of Columbus has this very distinct character.
The way you describe that, David, actually made me almost think that the book could do with an app or perhaps a computer program that goes with it, in which one sees sort of lights lighting up and then fading as the kind of preponderance of transoceanic connections changes over that long period of time. That prompted my next thought, which is, you've talked a lot about commerce. You mentioned the Indian Ocean in particular, but of course Atlantic and elsewhere. And one of the things that perhaps has become a conventional wisdom about, let's say, the period of the last 200 to 300 years, the period perhaps with which most, history buffs, amateur readers of history will be familiar, is one where trade and commerce and political conquest and invasion all go together, whether it's, the field I know, which is Chinese history, the Opium Wars, in which selling opium and also spreading British power go together, or the Portuguese Empire before that. Is that combination of commerce and politics something very specific to the modern era, or does your sort of longer sweep suggest that actually that kind of dynamic is something that we see across the whole sweep of oceanic history?
I think if we go further back in time, we can identify actually lots of cases where mercantile communities were established. I mean, I'm thinking here particularly of the Indian Ocean, but it would also actually apply in the medieval Atlantic along the shores of Europe and right down to the Straits of Gibraltar. Communities of merchants who were not sort of agents of any particular sort of political program of conquest, anything like that. That is something which I think in many ways really took off with the Portuguese, and then following them the Dutch and the English and other groups, as they realized trying to force their way into markets in the Indian Ocean. You think about the Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean, where they just relentlessly bullied the rulers of the small Indian kingdoms into admitting them, allowing them to set up trading stations. And they did this sometimes by massacring everybody on board ships, things like that, bombarding cities with extraordinary violence. But if you go further back in time, the creation of these mixed communities of merchants living side by side. I mentioned, for instance, these communities who came from these Jews from Cairo who turned up in southern India, living alongside Indians and living alongside Muslim merchants from the Central Islamic lands. And there's marvelous evidence for this sort of thing. There's some 9th century copper tablets written in the Malayalam language of southern India, which show us that people were converging on one of these towns from east and west, so from the direction of Thailand and Malaysia and so on in one direction, and also from the direction of sort of Aden and southern Arabia in the other direction, Persian Gulf, converging on these places under the protection of local rulers who realized that they could actually capitalize on the fact by creating a sort of hub where goods would be redistributed in each direction. And I looked in the book at a particular case, a really fascinating case of an early medieval trading empire, Srivijaya, based on the island of Sumatra. But historians had tended to think of Srivijaya as a sort of territorial empire which extended all over large areas of what are now Indonesia and Malaysia. But actually, when you look at it, what you realize is it was a sort of network of trading stations under the loose control of the Raja of the town of Palembang, which was a bit of a way inland and became a commercial center for all these traders. So it seems to me that let's go further back in time and we'll find that the nexus between conquest and setting up these commercial networks was by and large a rather weak one.
Fascinating combination there, David. When you made those comments, actually, it prompted another thought, which is a question about technology, really. We hear quite a lot of debate about ships and the importance of what kind of ships you have in terms of being able to trade or conquer or simply travel across the oceans. And I think we'd all say that industrialization, industrial revolution, creates a sort of mechanized system of shipping, which really does change the world, say, 200 years, 250 years ago. But actually, we also know that the Arab world Chinese world, various different groupings. Of course, the kingdoms of West Africa, which, thanks to the winner of the British Academy, Nayef El Rodan Prize last year, Toby Green's book, A Fistful of Shells, wrote about the trading empires of West Africa. There are all sorts of different societies with different means of actually setting sail on the ocean. Was that something that you had any chance to sort of compare and contrast?
Not actually sort of setting them side by side and drawing an explicit contrast, but I think it is something that emerges from various moments in the book. In fact, it's a rather tragic moment in the book. We have this merchant who turns up on the shores of the Red Sea. He's come down from Cairo, so it's back to that group of Jewish merchants I mentioned a moment ago. And he's actually the brother of the very famous philosopher Moses Maimonides, and he's going off to India to trade in jewels. And he sends a letter back saying that he's seen his ship, and the ship is the planks are all bound together, they're tied together by rope. He's never seen anything like this. And, he prayed to God that he would actually get there. Well, I'm afraid he didn't. The ship sank and he was drowned. So we have certain quite interesting sort of cultural assumptions here, because actually these ships, which were bound together in that way, which were sewn together, sewn plank ships, were actually much more suitable for these Indian Ocean waters. They needed that degree of flexibility to be able to cope with the very different sort of physical environment of Indian Ocean water compared to the Mediterranean water that David Ben Maimon would have been familiar with from his trading in the Mediterranean. So some of the ways in which shipbuilding adapted to the particular needs of certain environments. Again, coming back to Polynesia, of course, the great achievement of the Polynesians with these relatively small ships, often fitted with outrigger canoes with various types of sail, again, regionally variable, but clearly suiting particular physical conditions. You see this degree of adaptability, which the Europeans, when they came into the Polynesian islands much later, in the 17th, 18th centuries, in a way, their shipping was not well adapted to that physical environment.
I want to get back to some of the other arguments of the book in a moment, but the range of examples you've given us just in the conversation in the last 20 minutes or so means that I can't resist asking you, David, when you put together this work, which now exists as 1,000 pages, and when you say it's going to paperback, I imagine that's going to be a rather weighty paperback. I wouldn't want to drop it on one's foot, I think. How did you actually start sort of the craft of the process of bringing together a history of this sort? Because, for professional historians, and you're obviously very senior in that particular field, you start by going to perhaps an archive or a set of sources, and something that can be very deep but perhaps quite narrow in a sense. This is a book that's certainly deep in terms of its learning, but it's certainly not narrow in terms of how you approach it. So how did you start a project like this?
Yes, it grew out of the previous book, The Great Human History of the Mediterranean, in the sense that the basic idea, which is something of a challenge to the sort of orthodoxy established by the great French historian Fernand Braudel, who had this rather sort of deterministic view of how one should understand the history of the sea, that the physical environment was really the main determinant of even political events, even military victories like the victory at Lepanto in 1571. So it grew out of that. The basic method is similar, I think, in many ways. But what I really wanted to do, I suppose, was by taking the three oceans and beginning by comparing them in my mind with the Mediterranean, and beginning to think about ways in which they really differed, enormously differed from that small, narrow space. That was something which sort of helped to give me a sense of direction. But then, of course, there's the whole question of building the architecture. And so this idea of taking the three major oceans separately before Columbus, and that takes you to exactly halfway through the book. And then from Columbus onwards, what I've tried to do is to look at what I call the oceans in conversation, because it seems to me that, well, partly just to make the story manageable, frankly, but also what is really interesting about the history of the oceans from 1492 onwards is how it really repays the trouble of taking them together, trying to deal with them not as three separate spaces, but as three interacting spaces. Historians have tended recently to talk about them as the world ocean, which I think is a perfectly good way of describing it, trying to get away from those labels, Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean, which themselves were used in very variable ways. When you go to the 16th century, they'll often refer to the South Atlantic not as the Atlantic, which is a very ancient term, ancient Greek term, but they'll refer to the southern Atlantic as the Ethiopic Ocean, using the term Ethiopic to mean basically Africa, and the term Indian Ocean, which was extended to the concept of the Indies, actually embraced East Africa for many writers in the late Middle Ages. So it doesn't really make sense to impose our terminology on these oceans. And when you actually start looking at what's happening, you take the voyages of da Gama and his successors, the Portuguese, the end of the 15th century onwards, setting up what became a very regular traffic, not just to Calicut and eventually Goa and all these ports on the coast of India, but beyond that into the Pacific, to Macau, to Manila, to Nagasaki for a time, and then the Dutch took that over. We're dealing with the oceans really interacting in very cyclical ways, commercially, politically, and so on. So breaking down those boundaries seemed to me very important. And if you actually look at the writings which have been pouring, I mean, maritime history has become a very fashionable subject. You look at what's been written in the last 20 years or so, what you actually find, interestingly, is that Atlantic history has been even more popular in terms of publications, books, leading articles, and so on, than Mediterranean history, which is in a way where it all started. And we have David Armitage, a very distinguished historian at Harvard University, his famous declaration, "We are all Atlanticists now." So we were all being pushed in a way to becoming Atlantic historians, and I did indeed write a book about Atlantic history about 12 years ago. But actually what really repays attention is thinking of the interaction between the oceans.
Oceans are good to think with, to adapt another phrase of the era. One of the things that you talk about also, David, in the book is ports, without which clearly oceans as human nodes wouldn't function. You cite Rotterdam and Singapore as ports that succeeded, Liverpool as one that's failed. But I found myself also thinking that, of course, whether any of these ports are successful or failures, they've all had relatively short periods in world historical terms as successful ports. Singapore, a few hundred years, whatever it might be. Are there any places or ports that essentially have always been successful ports? Or does the success of a port really rise or fall on the back of a particular empire or a particular commercial crop that needs to be produced, or simply the way in which human societies have developed? Is success and failure really something that's defined by the sweep of time?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, demand for particular products has sometimes determined the success of a port. So Lisbon, if you go back to the late 15th, 16th centuries, the vast quantities, first of all, of sugar coming out of Madeira and other sources, which were then being passed on to Antwerp, which had its glorious moments, but then passed the baton on to Amsterdam in due course. That sort of sense that the focal points were changing in relation certainly to significant political changes that were taking place. The struggle for control of the spice routes. So the Venetians finding themselves at various points outmaneuvered by the Portuguese, but on the other hand, not doing quite as badly as a lot of historians imagined for a long time. But eventually Venice too, the Venetian nobility began to diversify in other ways, started becoming landowners in northeastern Italy and turned their faces away from trade. So there are these very fascinating shifts which have meant that really virtually none of those great centres of trade have that sort of continuous history of commercial preeminence. But what is really fascinating is to find one or two cases where somewhere was important centuries ago, lost its importance, and then recovered its importance. And you mentioned Singapore, because the archaeological excavations that have been done in Singapore in recent years have shown that in the 14th century, it was a very important commercial centre, linking the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. And then it lost that partly as a result of political upheavals. Malacca was founded, but Malacca sort of carried on exactly where it was a sort of carbon copy. I mean, the ruler of Singapore fled to Malacca and established Malacca. So in a certain sense, there wasn't a break because Malacca was the new Singapore. And now, of course, we find Singapore once again very much at playing a central role in the world economy. Raffles himself, when he founded, or I should say refounded Singapore, was very conscious of its earlier history. He was a great expert on the history and natural history of that part of the world. He wrote a history of Java. And one of the reasons he insisted on placing his new port there was that awareness. And another thing he did, which was unusual in that time, was not to name it after a member of the British royal family, but actually to recover its old name. But finding places that have had that sort of continuous history is certainly difficult. And I was thinking about some examples in the Caribbean where, again, you find this sort of local switching. So Santo Domingo, the capital nowadays of the Dominican Republic, initially after the Spaniards arrived was the great center. It still has these magnificent buildings from the very beginning of the 16th century. Nothing like it anywhere in the Americas. Certainly worth visiting when one can travel again. But its position as the famous silver route, bringing silver and other products out of Mexico all the way to Spain, as that began to develop. Havana turned out to be much better placed in terms of access, security, and so on. So you find that sort of shift within a relatively small space. So a sort of continuity, but it's not the same port all the time.
No, although actually that point about Singapore and being on the tip of the Indian Ocean and things that appear, disappear, and then reappear leads me perhaps just to take you up on one sentence from near the end of the book, David, which is the sentence, "Ocean history is coming to an end, at least in its traditional form." And in one sense, I know exactly what you mean. We tend to, well, until the COVID pandemic, we tended to fly places rather than to sail on liners or cargo ships. And yet I look at the Indian Ocean today and I see, the Chinese, actually the Japanese, also the Americans have military bases, naval bases at Djibouti. The Chinese are also building, with their money, a port at Gwadar in Pakistan. Aden is once again becoming an important place in the Near East. Singapore, as you mentioned, is kind of out there. In some ways, isn't the history of, let's say, the Indian Ocean today in some ways reproducing some of those dynamics of empire and expansion and conquest and commerce and trade that look very familiar to a historian like you?
Yes, well, let me answer in sort of two parts. The first part, addressing this idea of ocean history coming to an end, as you've hinted, it concerns partly how we travel across the oceans, that to take a passenger liner across a large oceanic space, compared, I mean, I'm not talking about short voyages across the Baltic or the Mediterranean, but to take that sort of journey, you would not think of going by sea. You would sit on an aeroplane and do in 6 or 7 hours what might have taken 6 or 7 days. But there's more to it than that. What I was also alluding to was the phenomenon of containerization and the way in which, coming back to ports, actually, the point you were making, ports like Rotterdam or Felixstowe or whatever, the ports of the 21st century, which handle phenomenal quantities of goods, and in the Far East, we've got Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on. These are places which no longer function so much as human communities. They are, I mean, Felixstowe is, of course, a very small town, but Hong Kong, Singapore are large cities, and they have their own life, their own economic activity, and so on. But as goods pass through them, the goods are passed through mechanically. We no longer have all these longshoremen and other people, stevedores and so on, loading, unloading goods, packing everything as best possible into the holds of ships, sometimes getting involved in industrial action and so on. All of that has been surpassed by the coming of containerization. So the port has become simply a machine, and the goods move seamlessly across, let's say, from Chicago to Warsaw. They've actually crossed the Great Ocean, and yet they've never really been exposed to ocean air. And that's partly, of course, also bound up with the whole question of costs. Now, 1 cent per can of beer sent across from the Far East to Europe, 10 cents per television set sent across. These very low costs have made these voyages perfectly viable. And the size of some of those ships, one of the illustrations in my ship is what was at the time the largest container ship in the world, but now been surpassed. Tens of thousands of containers moving across the Indian Ocean every day, hundreds of thousands moving across every day. So that is the first set of issues. Now, about the role of the Chinese, you're the expert on China, I should say, but this is an absolutely fascinating question, of course, and who knows how the COVID epidemic is going to transform world trade, which is a big question in itself. But it's very interesting to see how the Chinese, in making this bid for the recreation of the Silk Road of the Sea, not just the overland Silk Road with railways and so on. Silk Road of the Sea, possibly in two ways. One, an Arctic route, which involves a certain amount of argument with the Russians, who would like to maintain control of routes around the top of Russia, and the other, an Indian Ocean route. And as we've said, there are all these ports like Djibouti, in which China has managed to insert itself. And this then becomes bound up with a whole historiography in China about the Ming voyages at the beginning of the 15th century, the idea of sort of reviving the achievements of Zheng He, the great admiral who led these 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean, about which there's been a certain amount, put it mildly, of myth-making, indeed, complete nonsense sometimes. He's been compared with Columbus and so on. It's not a very useful comparison. But this whole question of China's relation to the sea is a fascinating one. And those periods in which the Chinese have tended to turn away from the sea, discouraging trade out from China, but never succeeding in doing so, and the Chinese emperors being willing to accept tribute, but no more than that, at least officially. And then other moments, the Song dynasty up to the 13th century and so on, which were much more open to trade. That was partly bound up with sort of the political configuration of China in that period. So it is fascinating to see the current Chinese government moving, if you like, in the same sort of direction, opening up to the sea in a way that the country has really tended not to do over the centuries. Though I would defer to you obviously on all those questions.
I suspect that perhaps a future David Abulafia is going to be writing a history in which, in a time perhaps of global warming, the Arctic Ocean maybe plays a more central role than it does now, as you've indicated. In just a few minutes, we will get to audience questions because I can see they're beginning to pour in on the side. But I just got a couple more things I wanted to throw at you before we finish, David. You've done the Mediterranean, you've done the oceans. Are there any other large bodies of water left for you to conquer as a historian, or will you be moving on to something else next?
Well, I don't want to give too much away, but what I would like to say is that I would like my next book to be a very short book. um, I've enormously enjoyed writing this book and its predecessor about the Mediterranean, but it would really be nice to write a book which was just about 200 pages. So maybe I should go for some small stretches of water. I was actually looking at a map of the Caspian Sea just a day or two ago, and I thought, well, that is a completely landlocked sea which never enters into anything I write, but it seems rather difficult to write its history. I'm not sure that anybody's ever tried, and I'm not sure that I will do that either. But if I can find some small stretch of water, I think I'll be quite happy.
Splendid. Well, if people want to send in their suggestions for any bits of water that David could write about, you have the chat function and ordinary questions. The very last thing before we open up to audience questions, as we will do in just a moment, David, you are here because we're celebrating your book as the winner of the 2020 Wolfson History Prize. You're joining the ranks of other very illustrious winners, the late Eric Hobsbawm, also Mary Beard, Simon Sharma, another one of them. All names have been very well known to any lover of history. What does it mean to you to have won this magnificent prize?
Well, the first thing is the recognition of an attempt, whether the judges were right or wrong, they think they've recognized an attempt to write history accessibly and readably, and that's something I value very much. I think it is so important that historians reach out to a wider public while at the same time maintaining a good standard of scholarship. And it's particularly important within the universities where, with all these research assessment exercises, or whatever they're called nowadays, there's a tendency to place such a premium on very, very focused monographs, very deeply researched, certainly very impressive work, which, you know, an academic historian has to be able to do and should do well. But we have to combine that with reaching out to a wide public, explaining what we do. I remember reading once that Sir Mortimer Wheeler, famous archaeologist, secretary of the British Academy in his day, knew another archaeologist who said that he wrote his books and articles for three other people. And that is what we really have to avoid. And I think it's actually got worse in a way because there's a tendency to immerse oneself in jargon in an attempt to sort of show off sophistication, to use things like network theory, which is not something I find at all useful, but, you know, the theory has to be there and so on. It can, of course, be very useful. But this, I think, distances what academic historians do from the wider public. And we have to reconnect. And the Wolfson Prize seems to me to be something that really encourages people to connect with that wider public.
And of course, we're doing that very much with this event today as well, where the Wolfson Foundation and the British Academy have come together to make sure that history doesn't just stay in the university library, but gets out to that very well-deserved wider audience. And some of that audience, as you know, David, has been sending in questions, and I think it's high time we started to get to some of those. So let me pass on, if I may, some thoughts on your talk and the question of oceans from our viewers and listeners today, who may be actually from around the world for all I know. I have the names, but not the locations. So let me, it's a rather good one here from Riff Winfield. And the question that Riff has sent us is, the distinction between seagoing and oceanic movement is significant, but how much was the experience of peoples bordering the Middle Sea or Mediterranean, which, as we mentioned, was the subject of a previous book of yours 10 years ago, how much was that experience mirrored by other maritime seagoing realms, such as in East Asia, the Caribbean, or the Indonesian archipelago? What's your thoughts on that, David?
Well, now it's something which interests me a great deal, actually, because one of the things I wrote, which acted as a sort of spur to this book, I didn't mention this earlier, was a little article I wrote called Mediterraneans, which was an attempt to compare the what I call the classic Mediterranean with some of these other seas, which were fairly randomly chosen, I have to say. The Caribbean was one of them, where even before the time of Columbus, we have the native Taino population moving around all the way from South America, moving around the islands and so on. Or if we take the Baltic, which is, I think, the number one example, sometimes referred to as the Mediterranean of the North. We have, during the Middle Ages, we have the same sort of phenomenon of a combination of mercantile enterprise and crusade against non-Christians, leading to the conquest, settlement, creation of towns, and so on in that region. So there are a lot of very useful comparisons that can be made. And the fundamental comparison, I think, is that in many of these cases, not perhaps the Caribbean, but if we were to take the South China Sea, for instance, it's that sort of intensity of contact across this maritime space, the way in which nearly all the different territories around these smaller seas become engaged in the creation of commercial networks and sometimes political networks as well. That is something which is very distinctive and which within the wider space of the oceans clearly takes on a rather different sort of character.
We have actually a question about the South China Sea in a wider sense, which comes in from Alan Bowden, David. So I might just follow up with that one. And Alan asks, coming to the present day and modern claims on, say, the South China Sea, what role do you think seas and oceans have to play in contemporary great power competition? I'm aware you're a historian, you're not claiming to be a sort of geopolitical analyst of the present day, but do you see a sort of what you see in the newspapers today a reflection of longer trends over the ocean, or is today's competition something quite new?
No, I mean, I think the South China Sea issue is, of course, an interesting one because it raises all sorts of questions about the significance of historic claims. And as I understand it, some of the claims which China is making are based on really quite ancient maps, which people are going to interpret in different sorts of ways. So there is that sort of sense that these claims based on maritime space have much longer roots, and we can also think in terms of issues to do with fishing rights. I mean, this is something which is very much in the public news at the moment when we just think about the situation between Britain and the EU, the current negotiations about fishing grounds. Um, so. Um, so I think that arguments about um, controlling maritime spaces are really quite relevant nowadays. Another example that comes to mind, which is actually a very important one, is the gas fields to the south of Cyprus, where you've got Israel, Lebanon, Cyprus, Turkey, Egypt. Have I got all the countries? Perhaps Syria, um, and the Greeks as well. You've got all these countries competing, and although there's certain areas which clearly belong to individual countries, at the same time there are overlapping claims and the potential for a great deal of tension emerging out of that. So I think that is a continuing sort of issue.
Question here, David, from Hugo Rain, who I think is clearly an aficionado of the Abalaffia canon, because he says, one of your most influential books remains your wonderful biography of Frederick II. If you were to go back to that work now that you've adopted some of the methodologies of global history, how do you think that the book would differ? So there's a testing one for you, I think.
Yeah, of the books I've written, it's the one which was most terrestrial. I mean, it does have Frederick going off on crusade, which took him across the Mediterranean. Does have him giving privileges to Lubeck, which led to its role, I suppose, as the effective capital of the Hanseatic League. Um, I don't think that my approach uh, to Frederick, would change as a result of all the work that I've done since then on the seas and oceans. I think what might change, though, is my assessment of the emperor. Perhaps I was a bit too negative about his cultural interests, about his some of his political ambitions, which I tried to sort of downplay the idea that he was this inveterate enemy of the papacy and so on. I might want to move a little bit, not a great deal, to middle ground on that. But no, I've wondered whether I should rewrite the book. It's a while since I did it, so that's certainly one idea in my mind.
A project to add once the short, sharp 200 pager has been
it
has
wouldn't
been
be
done.
the short, because that one
David.
was about 400 pages. Yeah.
Little longer. So a question comes in from Nicholas Lamar, and it is about, as it were, the missing link. Are there mentions of human interactions with the Arctic and Southern Oceans in your book, which you said you obviously don't deal with centrally, or are they still considered too young, despite the rich history in the past couple of hundred years or so? So, what's your take on that?
Well, I have, indeed. I have a chapter called The Fourth Ocean, which is about attempts to open up the Northeast and Northwest Passage. And these go way back in time. I mean, one of the illustrations in the book, and you can go, if you can get to Amsterdam, you can go and see in the Rijksmuseum some of the objects which were pewter candlesticks, pewter cups, things like that, recovered from Barentz's expedition for 1596 to 7, attempting to go around the top of Russia. So I deal with the Arctic very much, the Arctic Ocean very much as a possible route to get from the Atlantic into the Pacific, a possible sort of bypass, which it was thought would be quicker than going around the bottom of Africa at any rate, or going around the bottom of South America, and was actually thought to be climatically more congenial. They didn't realize that, only for a very brief period would the temperatures really be bearable for the sailors, but they were thinking in terms of the unbearable heat of some of those journeys across the equator. So it's certainly there and remains an issue in later chapters as well, because I write quite a lot about the Russian attempts to intrude into the Pacific, which took them right down the coast of North America, all the way down to Vancouver Island and beyond. So that is there, but obviously human intervention in that area. I mean, you've got peoples living in northern Russia who did navigate a little way along the coasts of the Arctic Sea, but that is not a sort of major story within the book. The Norsemen who got to Greenland didn't actually get into the Arctic Ocean as such. They were on its edge, as it were, but never actually in that ocean. The Southern Ocean and Antarctic Ocean seems to be more of a sort of geographical convenience. I mean, there are ways of defining it to do with the movement of the waters and so on. I don't really believe in it, if you like. I don't think it has enough of a separate existence, but I do have quite a lot. Again, a chapter called, oddly, Australia or Australia, i.e. named after Austria, which deals with attempts to find the southern continent. So there were these ideas that there must be a large southern continent to balance the globe, right? So in the 17th, 18th century, the idea that the globe really needs to, if you've got all this landmass on the top, you must have corresponding landmass on the bottom, and that it ought to be temperate as well, which of course turned out not to be the case. So the search for islands in the far south, never quite as far south as Antarctica. I mean, you have one French explorer who thinks that Tahiti is the edge of the southern continent. And for a time, and we go further back in time to Ptolemy and his ideas about an enclosed Indian Ocean. You even have sometimes Sri Lanka being projected as the sort of tip of a southern continent that projects deep into the Indian Ocean. So they are there, but they do play a lesser role, obviously.
Could I, David, put together two questions that have come in, which are on a related area? Both fascinating, I think. One is from Theo Sharkey, and the question that Theo sent is, in the course of your survey, have you found a significant change in the national or social outlook of peoples who've shifted from a traditional sea or land-based community to an oceanic civilization, such as occurred in Portugal in the 16th to 17th century? But let me put that together with a question which has come in from no name given, but I suspect this may be a true-born Englishman, because the question is there anything distinctive about the apparently quite British claims of natural authority over the oceans? Quote, the sea is the natural home of the Englishman, end quote, etc., etc. So national culture and the oceans, is there any kind of wider thread there?
No, it's a very interesting, an interesting question. I mean, one could answer it, I suppose, in different ways at different points in time. So, let me just give a couple of examples separated by a long period of time. If we were to think about the Dutch and the argument for an open sea, the argument that everybody, going back to Grotius in the 17th century, the argument that there is actually no sovereignty over the open spaces of the sea, limited sovereignty close into land, which was something that the Dutch found very convenient for a time, but then, of course, at other points totally ignored so that they could assert their own sovereignty. But that sort of sense that that the Dutch were trying to sort of, I was about to use the word globalize, it's not really the right word, is it? And yet at the same time, actually, were very aware that in order to achieve their objectives, they had to lay specific claims to specific territories out in the East Indies and so on. So how deeply is that immersed into the culture of the Dutch world of the Golden Age? And I'm trying to think back to places like there's a marvelous maritime museum in Amsterdam. I think, yes, I mean, I think one could say that the seas became part of that Dutch identity. But then I'm thinking about Portugal. I'm not thinking about Portugal in the 15th or 16th century so much as in the 20th century, with this attempt to project Portugal's connection with the sea as an almost sort of divine mission, with Salazar building this extraordinary monument to Henry the Navigator and his successors near the great monastery at Belém outside Lisbon, where Vasco da Gama is buried. And there's Henry the Navigator looking out over the Atlantic Ocean. So this is Portugal's destiny. And I think that did have a very important influence on the way that the Portuguese saw themselves. And in the case of Britain, clearly, yes, a sort of maritime destiny separating us from Europe. So, are we or aren't we really part of Europe? I'm not talking about Brexit or anything like that. I'm just talking about how historically we might have conceived of Britain's role within the world as the focus of this maritime network, something which, as it gets under the skin of the British.
Well, I think the audience would be relieved to know we're certainly not going to tackle the question of Brexit, but I think we've covered pretty much every other major issue in global history through the medium of the oceans, David. Could I once again thank David Abulafia for this wonderful conversation and offer hearty congratulations for the immensely well-deserved victory of The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans, which is out from Allen Lane. I think, as you say, will be in Penguin paperback pretty shortly and available from all good bookshops and even some slightly dodgy ones, I'm sure. Could I thank David and also thank the Wolfson Foundation? If you'd like to find out more about the Wolfson History Prize, please do go online to Wolfson History Prize, all one word, wolfsonhistoryprize.org.uk. Also, many thanks to the British Academy for hosting, and there are many online events, particularly during the current COVID situation, that you can find through our website, through our social media feeds, all of them available, I think, free to the public, so do please tune in for those. If If you'd also like to hear more, actually from David, but also all the other shortlistees for this year's Wolfson History Prize, and also the Wolfson History Prizes the last few years, go to the BBC Free Thinking website and just put Wolfson Prize into the search, and you'll find lots and lots of conversations with fascinating historians and their work, which are available there to listen to. It's been a huge pleasure to be part of this event today, from the Wolfson Foundation, from the British Academy, and from everyone who's been involved with this event. Thank you very much for joining us. Join us again soon.